This is the ClePunk podcast. This is dedicated to the Cleveland punk scene, a scene that planted its flag in the 1970s and that flag still stands today. You'll hear from the bands, the characters, the contributors, the lake rats, the gypsies of the Dead Man's Curve, and the dwellers of the East, West, and South Side. We let them tell the story like it isn't like it was. There's no holding back. What it was ClePunk. Welcome to the ClePunk podcast, and joining me today is Frank Mauceri, who for over 30 years has owned and managed Smog Veil Records. That's an independent label that largely focused on releases from bands from northeastern Ohio and the greater Cleveland area. The first decade of the label yielded a handful of 7-inch singles, some cassettes, and a CD. But by 1999, things got rolling, and in the next 20 years, the lion's share of the catalog took shape. When it ceased operations last year, Smog Veil catalog consisted of 147 releases, I think it said, and 139 were individual projects, and there were 8 comps. So we're going to cover 30 years of Smog Veil. We're going to get to know Frank, find out why he took this path. We're going to talk about his projects, the artists involved, listening to a few cuts, and let Frank tell us about the legacy that Smog Veil left behind. So welcome, Frank.
Thanks.
Hope the world's treating you well today.
Yes. While I'm on camera here, I'll try not to pick my nose. But yes.
You can do that. It's punk. So let's start from the top. Now, you weren't a musician.
No.
And aside from an unfortunate incident with you on the kit, which we'll cover later, you weren't a musician, but you came into the business as a fan first. So tell me about young Frank, and when did music take a turn from AM and FM to the netherworlds of punk?
Well, I, like a lot of kids growing up in Cleveland, started listening to music by listening to polkas in my grandparents' basement. I know who Frank. I knew who Frankie Yankovic was before I knew what Kiss was.
Me too.
And my favorite song was probably "I Lost My Kielbasa Down the Sewer" before it was anything else. But growing up, when I got to my teenage years, I figured out radio, and then I figured out college radio, and then I started buying records, and the rest is sort of history. I kind of figured out that I could take the bus from my neighborhood in Euclid downtown to go to Record Rendezvous, and that kind of like opened up a whole new, that and college radio opened up a whole new world.
So when was your time? Like, how old are you now?
58.
Oh, okay. So I've got 5 years on you. So I got to subtract all that in my head. It's like most of these guys are younger.
Yeah.
So you're like all that.
Just to put it in perspective, in 1980, I was 16 years old.
Okay. And that's when you were busting down from Euclid, and things were taking shape in Cleveland at that time, but they were just getting rolling at that time too, because there was like a little break post Pagans and before all the rest of them came out. Mm-hmm. And all that. So what were you listening to before that? Like FM music? You were just kind of doing your own, MMS crap and all that shit?
Yeah, but I gravitated from that to the far left end of the dial pretty quickly, Okay. So, college radio for me was a staple by the time I was 16 years old in 1980. And, like I said, that and trips to Record Rendezvous, and maybe 1 or 2 trips to the Drome when it was downtown, and then later when John had his garage sale, when he ended it all in Cleveland Heights. Those were kind of formative, I would say.
Cool. Then when did you take off for Columbus? When did you leave off for Ohio State?
That would have been at the end in fall 1983.
And you were there for all 4, or did you study law there or at Cleveland State?
No, I was there. I was at Ohio State for all 4, so I graduated in 1987, and then took a year off, and finally moved home to go to law school in 1988.
That's cool. What was going on in Columbus? Who preceded the New Bomb Turks as the bands? Because I was gone, I don't remember, and I've lived in
Yeah,
Columbus for
so
years.
New Bomb Turks would have been after my time,
After that, yeah.
but while I was there, Great Plains, Painful Discharge, Scrawl, those were probably the top three, that I knew that I sort of followed.
And you did college radio and stuff down there, and just
Yes,
help with
yes,
shows and all that.
yes. Ohio State had and no longer has a student-run radio station, WOSR, and I did college radio there for 3 years and made lifelong friends and contacts. I mean, I made contacts in the business. So
Awesome.
yeah,
Ohio State does not have a station anymore.
it has a NPR station, but it does not have a student-run radio station.
Oh, that's fun. Wow, who'd have
Yeah,
thunk it? A lot of
very
cash
sad.
down
I
there.
mean,
Unbelievable.
it's sad that a university that size doesn't have a student-run radio station, and it's
Beyond that.
what can you do?
No, I don't know. So on to the label now. So when did you start it? I know you. So did you start it before you went to law
No,
school?
no. So
or-
I was in my third year of law school, and I like I said, I had done college radio. I kind of had my hand in booking some shows here or there in Columbus, and I thought, well, I obviously collected records forever, and I thought, well, why don't I try my hand at starting a record label? And so I had this friend in law school who was also wanted to do that. His name was Andy Gary, and we said, hey, why don't we start a label? And that's what we did. And we had to find bands to release. And I said, hey, I'm good friends with Chris Andrews, and obviously he started the Spud Monsters, and it's the most popular band in Cleveland right now. So why don't we do a Spud Monsters record? And Chris was hip to the idea, and away we went.
So take me through that first decade. Then you had about. It looked like you had about 8 to 10 releases in that first maybe 7, 8 years.
Yeah, so I mean, the Spud Monsters was an easy sale. It was a 7-inch, and I think there was a cassette version as well. And we did 2 7-inchers with them. And then we sort of had this idea that because we were trying to release new bands, and we sort of had this idea, well, Erie is just 70 miles to the east, and if you're in a band in Cleveland, there's only so many opportunities to play live, and playing live is how the bands basically sold a lot of records. So why don't we go over to Erie? There's kind of a small punk rock scene there. Why don't we take bands over to Erie and have some weekend gigs when nothing else was going on? And so I found this band, My Three Scum, or they found me, and 2 guys in the band, Larry Weaver and Bob Kellogg, were booking shows there on a regular basis, and they booked into small rooms, bars that had maybe a capacity of 100 or 150. But then again, if you had nothing to do in Cleveland on a Friday or Saturday night and were looking for a gig, you could go over there and you could easily pack the room, and that's how it kind of grew from just a couple 7-inchers regionally to a couple 7-inchers in a couple different towns, and it got to be known a little wider at that point.
Cool. What rooms were those guys playing in Cleveland back then?
In Cleveland, it would have been the Odeon, which is much larger. I believe they had a club beneath that. I don't think it was the Odeon. It was the Fantasy. Euclid Tavern was still going, so you could play there. I think some of those are parking lots now around the new baseball stadium.
And this is circa mid 90s or mid 80s?
Yeah, so this would have been, I started the label in 1991.
Oh, okay.
This would have been like 92, 93.
93. Cool. So why don't we take a second and listen to some Spud Monsters and My Three Scum? Come back. Thanks, Frank. We'll be right there. So we just heard Black Lies by the Spud Monsters and two tracks from My Three Scum, I'm on Drugs and Straight Edge. So
So
tell me about
yeah,
these guys, Frank.
let's see. Black Lies, I believe, was from the second Spud Monster 7-inch that we did, and that one is self-titled, although the graphic on the front says Erba shoots smack, which is kind of a joke about Tony Erba. He doesn't shoot smack. Tony doesn't shoot smack. It was just a joke. And then the cuts you played from My Three Scum, one was from the first 7-inch we did with them, which I think had two pressings, and then the second cut you played, Straight Edge, was from a split 7-inch that we did with that band and another band from Japan whose name eludes me right now. But those records all sold really well, and
So
you
what's
know,
that? Like, what do you mean sold well? Like, how many did you press and what? Like,
well, when we started the label, that was sort of the tail end of you could just run an ad in Maximum Rock and Roll and you would easily sell 500 records. And I think the
really?
Spud Monsters, we went through. I mean, there were two pressings on that, so there was 1,000 and then 500, and then probably another 500 cassettes, and that split 7-inch with my three scum. The split 7-inch, I think we just did one pressing of 500. The first 7-inch, we did two pressings. There was one on red, and then another one on red or maybe black. And we again, it was 1,000 the first run, and then 500 the second run. And the funny thing about the Spud Monsters, very first 7-inch that we did, the Destroy Your Idol 7-inch, the first pressing, I believe there was, say, 800 on red. But I always wanted to like turn the tables on collectors, and collectors, like colored vinyl. So we did 800 on red, but then we did 200 on black, and then all the black 7-inchers were given away to radio stations. So if you're holding that first press of the first 7-inch on black, that is the rarest of all the records from them that we did. But the Spud Monsters, based upon their sales and their live shows, they eventually signed with a metal label in Germany, and then they really took off. I mean, they toured Europe 3 or 4 times, and I'm sure that accounted for some of the sales on the tail end of the second pressings of those records. But I mean, they really took off, and Chris had his record shop, of course, Chris's Warped Records, and it was just a big bonus, it was just an obvious thing to have them as the first band on the label. It just made it really easy. In those early days too, that's when Scat Records was getting off the ground, and Scat was trying to also be a distributor, so they bought a bunch of records from us. It wasn't hard back then to sell records, even though it was sort of the tail end of the vinyl days and the beginning of the CD days. It was fairly easy.
Who else was in the band, the Spud Monsters? Do you
Don
remember?
Foose was the singer, and he's been in a number of different bands since the Spud Monsters broke up some years ago. And I think he's also like a cookbook author as well. He's like this vegan yoga workout crazy dude. I always liked hanging out with Don. And when the Spud Monsters would play Erie on a Friday or Saturday night, we would, at least my wife and I, Lisa, would drive over to check them out, and then for whatever reason the band would stay behind in Erie to party, and Don always had to get back to Cleveland, so he would hitch a ride with us to get back. And I can always remember on like Saturday night gigs trying to get back to Cleveland and wondering if we were going to beat the paper boy back, if the Sunday paper was going to be waiting on my front step, if we'd get back before then.
That's
But
awesome.
those were good days. Those were fun days when I wasn't yet 30 years old, and it was going to gigs on a regular basis. It was a thing.
Who is Larry Weaver and Bob Kellogg?
So Larry Weaver and Bob Kellogg were in My Three Scum.
Okay.
We did. I think 3 records with them, and maybe they made a couple compilation appearances as well. But they were constantly booking bands, like I said, in smaller rooms in Erie. State Street Tavern was like the hot place to play. And like I said, they only had a capacity of, say, 100, and you could easily pack it out on a Friday or Saturday night. And then they moved on to like a larger venue, the Continental Ballroom, which is kind of infamous in Erie for punk rock and hardcore shows. It was a little larger. It was a little harder to fill because the population there is kind of small.
Mm-hmm.
But for whatever reason, they were able to do it, and they booked like everyone. I mean, from like Youth Brigade to Slapshot, the popular hardcore bands at the time. They booked them in Erie, and it was like Erie is like this tiny town, but it was a fun place to play, and the kids really appreciated it. And like I said, if you were a band in Cleveland and had nothing to do on a Friday or Saturday night, just get in touch with Larry or Bob, and you could probably get a gig out of it. And eventually, they formed their own label, Erie Records, EERIE, and they had a record shop, and they had a stage in a record shop, and it was fun while it lasted. But eventually, like most punk rock bands, they just kind of disintegrated. And Larry and Bob though they've been lifelong friends. And later on, I distributed Erie Records digitally because they didn't have any access to a digital distributor, and so you just make those connections. And as a record label, and you're just trying to grow the catalog, it was a good way to do it.
That's cool. So by '98 or so, it seemed like you guys got your sea legs and you started putting out release after release after release after release.
Yeah.
So who was a part of that whole phase, the beginning of that phase anyway, and
Well,
who was helpful in that?
yeah, like I said, I've always been a record collector, and I got to know Cheeseburger, who was in the Pink Holes, because I was buying records from him here and there, and he was a fan of the label, and he said, you ought to like draw upon all these bands that you were a fan of in the '80s, like the Dissidents and the Pink Holes, and do reissues. Bands that maybe they had a release, maybe not. Those releases were out of print and basically unavailable. And there was a growing market for reissues in old punk rock, mainly by bootleg. But if you could do it legitimately, you could develop your label and grow the catalog. And some of these were sort of inexpensive because they were already recorded. There might be some mastering work involved, some studio wizardry. And I thought, hey, this is a great idea. So I got back in touch with Paul and Scott from the Dissidents with the help of Cheeseburger. And that was the first, reissue. They had all these recordings, basically bedroom recordings, basement recordings. And, it was an album's worth of stuff that never got released. And we could do it inexpensively. It still wasn't that hard to sell records. There was a growing market for this kind of thing. So I was like, all right, well, let's give it a try.
And when you worked with the Offbeats, did Relativity still own the record that you re-released, or?
That one, I really don't know.
Oh,
I mean,
good.
I got in touch with Tom Miller.
Because they were on a label. I mean,
Yeah, they were on a regular label.
As opposed to the Dissidents and some of the other bands, they were actually on.
Right.
Yeah.
So bands that were self-released, like the Dissidents, the Pink Holes, easy. Bands that were on another label, it got to be, 10, 12, 15 years after their records were out, and a good 10 years since their records were in print. So, as long as if the other labels still existed, and many of them did not, they weren't really coming to sniff around for, their cut of, 500 or 250 records that you were going to sell.
So that's how it worked. You just rolled the dice and
just roll the dice and see what happens. And and generally nothing ever happened.
Well, it sounds like it. So, well, why don't we take a break and let's listen to a few cuts from the Dissidents, Offbeats, and Pink Holes that kind of represent that first phase of reissues from Smog Veil Records, and we'll be right back with Frank Mauceri from Smog Veil.
once was a time. Radio was on a line. People sit at home and stare. Watch themselves in the mirror. They thought it would be rare to listen to dead air. Seconds are down. 10,000 watt town. No one really cares. They don't think it's fair. They thought it would be rare to listen to that air. Seconds are gone. He must play another song. Now the people don't care. They don't think it's unfair. And now it's not rare listen to that air. To listen to that air. To listen to that air. To listen to that air. Space had filled the room. Music must resume.
just heard The Dissidents with Dead Air and Detention. You heard Sad by the Offbeats, and It Was Pink by the Pink Holes. Do we call them the Pink Holes? Do we call them Les Black's Pink Holes? What do we call them these days? What's the
Well,
way to...
yeah, I mean it's less black in the Amazing Pink Holes, but everyone in Cleveland refers to it as the Pink
The
Holes.
Pink Holes. I remember
Yeah.
when they used to play up in Boston, and I never went. We were actually, the night they played in Boston, my band was playing across town, on the other side of town. Well, not too far. They were like at the Rat or something, and we were up at the
I
Kells.
actually think those are the only out of town gigs the band ever played.
Really?
Yeah.
I think they play with a band called Big Hunk of Cheese. I want to say, I can't. I really do. I want to say that, or they were coming on the next night because I was in the Rat drinking that afternoon, and I was like, I saw the Pink Holes, and then I was
Yeah.
like, Big Hunk of Cheese. Maybe they were the next night, but I don't know. So, what about those three cuts? Tell me a little bit about your
Well-
stint with the Dissidents and
Yeah,
all that.
well, like you had mentioned at the beginning of this podcast, that I came to this from a fan perspective, and I was a fan of all three of those bands, but the Dissidents, on one of my forays to Record Revolution, I'm sorry, Record Rendezvous downtown, I had a chance meeting with Paul Slava and Scott Stemple, and I didn't know those guys previous to that, and they told me about the Dissidents, and they said that they needed a drummer, and I didn't play any musical instruments. I've never played an instrument. I have no idea how to play the drums, but immediately I said, yeah, I can play the drums. And so they drafted me into the band, and we had a couple rehearsals, and it was pretty obvious that I was the world's worst drummer. I had no idea how to play the drums, but it was kind of a neat entree into their world, and so they introduced me to Jim Jones, the Easter Monkeys, and Jim never forgot who I was, and we'll probably get to that eventually, but and that's how I found out about the Offbeats, and I think Tom had done an early cassette comp, the Oops comp, and
This tape sucks.
yeah, this tape sucks, and I immediately I got a copy of it, and I immediately became a fan of every one of those bands, and any chance I got to see those bands, I went and saw them. So, it was these chance meetings as a fan. It was these chance meetings that really kind of were formative and really kind of influenced the label years and years later. And I was happy those things happen. Yeah.
Well, of course, and then Cheese talked to you about these reissues, obviously with the Pink Holes, while you were doing the Dissidents and the Offbeats, and that's how that whole thing transpired, because they had when their run was over when you released their first stuff, right?
Yeah, they weren't they weren't a functioning band at that point. They had done a couple reunion shows some years earlier, I think, maybe for Bob Ritchie's birthday or something, or wedding or something, but they weren't a functioning band, and their records, for all intents and purposes, were out of print. They had 2 LPs that they had released during their day, and so the one thing about doing reissues, which is kind of cool, versus doing bootlegs, is that if you do a legitimate reissue and get in touch with the band that you want to, feature on a release, you find out that a lot of these bands have songs that they recorded that are sitting on a tape in someone's attic that never got released, and you can sort of do these like extra tracks and exclusive stuff that make these releases a little more interesting to the fan and buyer. And so and the Pink Holes did. They had all these extra songs, and so we were able to include those, and it was really there really is a big advantage to doing legit reissues versus bootlegs. And so I'm really glad I went that route, because it's easy to do bootlegs. It's a little harder to do reissues, but the results, I think, are definitely discernibly better.
Absolutely. Now, after you cut your teeth with all of the first reissues that were like 10, 6, 7, 8 year dead bands, you kind of hit your stride with a relationship with Rocket from the Tombs.
Yeah.
How did that was the next kind of push for Smog Veil. So tell me how that started.
I think it was in '98 or '99. Jim Jones from the Easter Monkeys, who's also a member of Per Ubu, and also had another band, Foreign Bodies, got in touch with me and said, hey, there's never been an official Rocket from the Tombs retrospective. There had been numerous bootlegs of the band's recordings, but there had never been an official retrospective. And Rocket from the Tombs, anyone who understands or has any knowledge of Cleveland underground rock and roll history knows that Rocket from the Tombs is this really, really important band, sort of like the link between the Stooges and MC5 and 77 punk rock. In between is Rocket from the Tombs. And Jim said, David is interested in putting together an official retrospective, and you seem to have a good ear for the market, and you've built some notoriety around the label. Would you be interested in doing it? And it took me like a second to think about that.
Yeah, I play
Of
the
course.
drums.
Yeah. Yeah, of course. It was my second I play the drums moment.
Right.
Of course I'll do it. And the thing is, at that time, the label was just basically a two-person operation. It was just my wife and I, selling records out of the basement of our house. And we had a distributor, a couple different distributors that we were using. But I kind of knew that, this would sell. And so, David, put it together, put together all the tracks and liner notes and photos. And John Thompson, that is Johnny Dromette, did all the graphics. And
Bobby helped on that too, didn't he, or no?
No, it was all John.
It was all John?
Yeah. And so it was kind of an easy thing to do, but we didn't have the things that we had later, like someone who handled the press and someone who handled the mail order. It was just, like I said, my wife and I. So when we finally put the record together, we were living in Reno at the time. The first initial shipment of that was basically everything was piled up in my living room. We had little paths here and there that we can walk in my living room. But basically, the living room from wall to wall, floor to ceiling, was filled up with Rocket from the Tombs records that we had pre-sold or that distributors had, wanted to buy from us. And it was crazy.
How many of those
really
did
was
you press?
crazy. On the LP, we did 3 presses. The first press was 1,500. The second press, I believe, was 700. And then there's a third press of just 25 copies. And the reason why it's only 25 is because that's all the covers, the gatefold double LP covers that we had left over. And for that pressing, the pressing plant did us a big favor in every single record. So there's 25 copies in that pressing, and so there's 50 total LPs. It's a double LP release, and every single record within that is a different color. And then all the surviving members autographed the covers, and then they were given away. That third press was just given away to the band members and friends and for our label archives. But on the CD, I believe we did 5 pressings, and the first pressing was, I don't know, like 5,000. The second pressing was like 5,000. The third pressing was probably 5,000, and then the fourth was maybe 1,000, and the fifth was just 1,000. And it consistently sold, and that kind of also got up to the the digital age. So on downloads, it was just thousands upon thousands upon thousands. And it was amazing. It was just an amazing record. And David remarked to me once that he thought that those iconic which later became iconic Per Ubu and Dead Boys songs, which were originally Rocket from the Tombs songs, Sonic Reducer, Final Solution, 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, Ain't It Fun. In his opinion, the definitive recording of those songs appears on that Rocket from the Tombs retrospective. And for me, I mean, it was an honor. I mean, an honor to be the label that gets to release those, and I really hope we did it justice. I think we
Oh,
did.
you did.
Yeah, and
Absolutely did.
you know, and the band, the surviving members of the band, three of them anyways, Cheetah, David, and Craig Bell, decided, hey, let's give it a shot. Let's reform, and they drafted Richard Lloyd from Television to be a second guitarist, and Steve Melnick, who was the drummer for Perubu at the time, played drums, and embarked on a couple tours, and those tours were, I mean, the one giant U.S. tour that they did, I think there was like 45 dates, and I imagine that most of those were sold out. I mean, it was just,
Yeah.
it was crazy.
Tell me
You know,
about the show in Austin. You mentioned once to me there was a show in Austin. that
Yeah,
had
I'll
some-
have to. Yeah, there was two things about that tour I remember. First of all, it started in San Diego, and my wife and I were living in Reno at the time, so we met the band, and we had all the merchandise. So I met the band in San Diego, provided them with the merchandise for the tour. The second gig was in LA. The third gig was in San Francisco. There's like 40 more gigs to go after that, and we had sold out all the merchandise after those three gigs. But we had some in the warehouse in Reno. So my wife and I drove from San Francisco to Reno. The band had a day off before they played Portland. We basically filled up my pickup truck with everything, every single empty space in the pickup truck was filled with either LPs or CDs. Drove up to Portland and, caught up with the band, and they finally had merchandise again, and on they went. But then that was the last gig that I attended until they were going to be in Austin, and I was going to provide them with some more merchandise when we got to Austin. And so Cheeseburger, he was in Vegas for some reason, and I met up with him, and I said, hey, let's drive to Austin. I convinced them that we could drive to Las Vegas to Austin in one day, which is
You can't do
that's
that.
totally impossible.
You can't even do that on meth.
It's impossible.
No way.
So, we drove to some small town in Texas, as far as we could drive, and then we
Jeff
stayed.
Smith.
Yeah, stayed in some Fleabag hotel. Woke up the next morning, drove to Gary Lupico. Gary Lupico is a Clevelander that he did some early studio wizardry for the label for a lot of reissues that we did, and he had eventually moved to Austin, and he said, yeah, come on down and stay with me, and we'll go to the gig. So we get to Gary's, we go to the gig that night, and it was at Emo's, and Emo's in Austin it's kind of a neat club, but this is January, and the club is where the stage is at. There's a roof over it, and the back half there's no roof over it. So it's like it's kind of like a patio stage, and it was January, and I think it was freezing rain that night, and it was maybe 40 degrees, and the guys from Rocket from the Tombs are not young people. No. And this was a rock and roll band, not a punk rock band. But anyways, it's sold out. The gig is sold out. The band comes on stage, and someone throws a beer on stage, and it kind of wasn't cool. And David was pissed, and he says, if that happens again, I'm out of here. And it happened like a second later, once they restarted their first song, and they were gone. They walked off stage, and I looked at Cheese, and I said, we just drove a day and a half to see 45 seconds of music. And so a minute later, Cheetah comes back on stage and says, hey, wait a minute. I'm trying to work this out. Don't anyone go anywhere. And, a couple minutes later, the band comes back on stage, and David says, if this happens again, I'm out of here. And it didn't happen again, fortunately. The band played their set. It was an amazing set. The Austin Statesman reviewed it and said, that was the greatest rock and roll show they had ever seen. And, I would second that. I mean, it was amazing. It was just amazing under very difficult circumstances.
Yeah. And Emo's is a cool room, and it's off the beaten path. I mean, it's like there's not, Stubbs is right down the street from it, but it's off the beaten path. It's a block away from 6th Street. It's 2 blocks from the Ritz. It's like, it's not in the midst of it all. It's closer to the Sheraton than it is anything else.
Yeah, it's
But it's a cool
it's a
ass
cool
club.
room. It's a cool room. It was a cool room. I don't think it exists anymore, but
Oh,
it's
well, I've been there. Dude, last time I was there was 10 years ago,
yeah.
and it was there because somebody was playing there. Anyway,
It's been some time since I've been there, but
yeah.
it's not someplace you want to be in freezing rain and 40 degrees.
No,
Because,
no.
yeah.
Austin itself is so lame anymore. Anyway, Gary's widow, told me best when she picked us up that night in Gary's old El Camino, and we were driving by Emo's actually on the way to the barbecue joint. She said, "Wasn't Austin cool when they didn't have to remind you it was weird?" And I was like,
Yeah.
"Absolutely," because I lived down there in the early '80s, and it was like such a cool place. It's changed
Yeah.
so much.
Yeah.
But I don't know. So let's go back to Gary. He was, like you said, a wizard in the studio and did so much on a couple fronts, right? I mean, not only did he
Oh yeah.
provide great recordings with California Speed Bag, but also the mastering work and the recording work that he did with you. I know he worked with me on a comp that we did through Smog Veil, and that was the one time I really got to work closely with Gary for a weekend, and we had a shit ton of fun. It was just a blast. But
Yeah,
tell me about Gary.
Gary had a really keen understanding of what I was trying to accomplish with the label. Plus, he was in bands during that era. Gary
Some of
was
the best, the kneecappers, dude.
Gary
I
was
mean,
in the Kneecappers, and by the way, the original name of the Kneecappers was the Dead Kennedys.
absolutely.
And every once in a while, every couple of years, it seems I run into Jello Biafra somewhere. I live in San Francisco now. My wife and I do, and every once in a while we run into Jello, and he always asks me, "Hey, are there any Dead Kennedys recordings, the Cleveland Dead Kennedys, because I want to release it on my label?" And I'm like, "Nah, I wish there were, but nah." But Gary was in that band. It was in the Kneecappers, and someone did a Kneecappers retrospective. It was really really good. But so Gary
Absolutely.
understood. Gary understood, exactly, what I was trying to accomplish, and he was there, and so he knew, he knew what the bands were trying to accomplish too, and he knew what sound they were trying to accomplish, and he could really master to an expert degree to get that 1979 or 1983 sound out of these recordings, and sometimes we recorded, if we were lucky, we recorded from an actual master, but that didn't happen as often as you think. More than not, we mastered from a cassette recording or even a needle drop. I think the Pink Holes were recorded from needle drops, where they had a pristine copy of their record, so we took that and made basically a recording of the record, and that's the master. And there was nothing else to master from it. But Gary really could sort of perfect that. And if it wasn't for him, we would not have been able to do the reissues that we did.
Absolutely. Now, did you go to him with Speedbag, or did you just hear about him? Because that was a great band, and they ended
Oh
up
yeah.
on Smog Veil, and
Yeah.
I mean, it was a great country band.
Yeah, I mean, I knew about them. I don't think I had ever seen them perform live, but Gary said that they had recorded a record, and it never got released, and would I be interested in releasing it? And of course. I mean, of course. And it was a great set of recordings, and it was a little different. It was a little. I always kind of thought, well, when the fans expect the label to do something, I want to do sort of the exact opposite. And so, all the reissues that we did were sort of punk rock or pre-punk or just sort of off the wall, like Tin Huey, and we did some hardcore stuff, because I was a fan, and I think fans sort of expected that that's what we were going to continue to do. And then Gary said, well, we got this record and we never released it, would you like to release it? And I was like, yeah, sure, because it's the direction that I need to go once people decide that I'm only going to go in one direction. So I'm going to do something different, and that's what we did. And it's a wonderful record. It's a beautiful record.
Oh, it works totally in the catalog, number one, and not just because Gary's credibility and Russ's and the rest of them, because but the band was great. They were solid. The originals were all originals, and Gary wrote
yeah.
amazing songs. We used to.
Oh, yeah.
I covered Button Willow in my country punk band up in Massachusetts. I mean, we just thought so much of him and always introduced it, to Gary.
Yeah.
But why don't we listen to Marilyn Monroe, which was one of your choices off that record, would have been mine too.
Yeah.
I love them all. But why don't we listen to Marilyn Monroe?
Oh, yeah.
And come back and talk to a little bit more with Frank.
Sure.
Thanks.
Well, what's the secret here? I know I've got my faults. Sometimes I drink a little, sometimes I drink a lot, and I dress a little down. Ain't that good enough for you? No, I ain't the Marlboro Man or the cover of GQ, but I ain't seen you in Vogue. Ain't seen you in Vogue. We all need a little room to grow. Who died and left you, Marilyn Monroe? Who died and left you, Marilyn Monroe? You say I'm falling far behind. Well, your behind is falling too. I may be pushing middle age, but not as hard as you. Yeah, I know I've got my faults, and I'll gladly take the blame. But I'm happy as a clam. Baby, can you say the same? I may have lost my youthful glow, lost my youthful glow. But I just wanna